In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to work out how much fabric you need for your quilt binding. Hi, this is Tom from How to Quilt It, and today we've got a great video for you that's going to show you exactly how to work out how much fabric you need for your quilt binding. It's really simple, it's really easy, and there's a great formula that you can follow that's going to show you exactly what you need. Now don't worry about trying to take notes as we go along. There's going to be a handout in the description below that you can download, and that will have an example calculation and then a table for you to fill out with your own measurements that's going to help you to work out your binding. This video is not about how to make binding or how to attach it to your quilt, it's just to figure out how much fabric you need to order. So when I first started making quilts, I would always end up ordering way too much fabric and end up with loads of fabric left. So as soon as I figured out this formula, it helped me to really cut down on the wastage of fabric, although any fabric in the stash is not wastage. I usually tend to find that I bind with a similar colour to the border that's on my quilt, if there is a border, or a similar colour to the backing. So generally whatever I need for the backing, I'll just add the binding yardage onto that. So here we go, let's take you through the steps. So the first step is we need to measure your quilt. So what we're talking about here is the finished quilt sandwich. So that's your backing fabric, the batting in the middle, and then the quilt top, which has then been quilted either on a long arm or on a domestic sewing machine, and then it's been trimmed down to size. So find yourself a nice big space where you can lay your quilt out nice and flat and get a measuring tape and measure that width and measure that length and then fill it in the table in the worksheet. Handy little tip for you: if your quilt top is really large, for example if you're doing a king size quilt, you can fold it in half, measure it whilst it's folded in half, and then multiply that by 2 to get the total width. And again, you can do the same for length: fold it in half, measure it, multiply it by 2, and that will give you the total length. So let's talk about the fabric for a second. Today in this video we're talking about straight cut binding. So that's binding that's not cut on the bias of the fabric, as in it doesn't stretch, so it's not suitable for doing curved quilts. What we need to know is the total width of our fabric and then the size of the selvages that are on that fabric. So the average width of quilting fabric is between 42 to 44 inches from selvage to selvage. What we need to know is what is the usable width of that fabric after the selvages have been removed. So most fabrics, as I said, are 42 to 44 inches wide with the selvage. Most salvages are up to an inch wide. It depends on the manufacturer, depends on what information is put on that salvage. So the best thing you can do is kind of measure from where you think you're going to cut the salvage off on both directions, and that will give you the usable width. And we're going to be working with an assumed usable width of 40 inches of fabric. And what happens is that we take that fabric, however big it is that we need, we cut it into strips that are the width of the binding that we're going to use, and we remove the salvages. Now some people will remove the salvages before they cut the binding strips. Other people, like myself, I prefer to cut the salvages off after I've cut the fabric into binding strips. Now let's talk about the actual calculations. Don't worry if you're not good at maths, you don't need to be good at maths, you just need to be able to use a calculator and do some basic multiplication and division. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to work out the total length of a binding strip that we need. So this means the perimeter of the quilt, measuring it all the way around. So the shortcut to doing this is to take the width and multiply it by 2, and then add the length multiplied by 2, and that will give you the total length or the perimeter of your quilt. Once we know the perimeter or total length of the quilt, we now need to know the number of strips that we need. And so to do this, we need to take that number, that total length required, and divide it by the usable width of fabric. So that usable width is the fabric minus the salvages. So you take the total length and divide it by the usable width of fabric, and that will give you the number of strips that you need. Now we need to convert the number of strips needed into yardage so that we can buy our fabric. So to do that, it's really simple. We just need to take the number of strips from the last step, multiply it by how wide the binding strip is unfinished, and then divide that by 36. Now, widths of binding are either dictated in patterns that you're following, or they are a personal preference. My personal preference is 2.5 inch cut strips of binding that are then folded in half, attached, and then folded in half again. So the example that I'm going to show you, we're going to be working with a 2.5 inch wide strip of binding. The quilt that we're using in the example here is a twin size quilt. So the quilt is 50 inches wide and it's 65 inches long. So it's a rectangle. So first of all, we need to work out the total length or perimeter of the quilt. So to do that, we take the width times 2 and then add the length times 2. So in this case, that's 50 times 2 plus 65 times 2 equals 230 inches. Next, we take that with the usable width of our fabric to work out how many strips we're going to need. So the usable width of the fabric we assumed is 40 inches. So we take 230, which is the total length or perimeter of the quilt, and divide that by 40 to get 5.75 strips. Now we need a little bit of extra just in case we need a bit of wiggle room, so we always round that up to the nearest whole number. So in this case, we're rounding that up to 6 strips. And then finally, we need to know the yardage. So that's the number of strips times the width of the binding divided by 36. So in this example, as I said, our binding strip is 2.5 inches wide and we need 6 strips. So we take 6 and times that by 2.5 and then divide the answer by 36 to get 0.41. And then we need to convert that into yardage, so we round it up to half a yard. Now in the hand sheet, there is a chart on the last page that shows you how to take a decimal and convert it to nearest eighth of a yard of fabric. Now let's look at an example using one of my quilt tops. So this pattern you see here, this is Nonchalant by Natalia Bonner. And I've altered the pattern slightly to add 2 borders to this. You can see there's a white border which frames the log cabin blocks and makes them sort of float, looking a little bit wonky, and then there is a blue dark border to frame it and finish it off. Now in this instance, this quilt has a backing fabric which is the same color as that blue border, and it's going to be bound in the same color as the blue border. So this quilt is 70 inches wide by 82 inches long. So now let's look at the calculations using this example. So the quilt is 70 inches wide by 82 inches long. So we take the width times 2 plus the length times 2. So 70 times 2 plus 82 times 2 equals 304 inches. Next, to get the number of strips needed, we take a usable width of fabric, which in my case is 40 inches after the selvages have been removed. And we take the total length and divide by that usable width. So 304 divided by 40 is 7.6 strips. And we want to round that up to the nearest whole number, which in this case is 8 strips. To get the yardage required, we take the number of strips times the width of the binding and then divide that answer by 36 to get the yardage. So we need 8 strips that are 2.5 inches wide. Divide that by 36 gives us 0.55. And we round that up to 5/8 of a yard. So in this instance, to make my 8 strips of binding, I need to get 5/8 of a yard of that blue fabric. And so that was it. That wasn't that scary. That was nice and simple. Once you know those 3 steps, you can figure this out all in your head or on a piece of paper. So just remember, you need to know the width and the length of your quilt top, and you need to know the width of the binding strip and then the usable width of your fabric. The first step is to work out the total length needed, which is the width times 2 plus the length times 2. We then need to know the number of strips needed, which is the total length divided by the usable width of the fabric. And then to get the yardage needed, we take the number of strips multiplied by the width of our binding strip and then divide the answer by 36, rounding up to the nearest 8th yard. So I hope you found this video really helpful today. This video is for straight cut binding. It's not for working out bias binding, and we will be making a video similar to this in the future about how to calculate fabric for bias binding. Now don't forget, there is a worksheet for you that will make this much easier to remember. You can get the link to download it in the description below. In that, there is an example working through a real life quilt, and then there is a table that you can fill out. You're also going to find in that handout a rounding up chart. And what this does is it shows you the decimal numbers that you get when you're working out the yardage and how to round them up to the nearest 1/8 of a yard. So if you found this video useful, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and make sure you click that notification bell so you get notified next time I release a new video. And leave me a comment below letting me know what you thought about this video and if there's any other video topics that you would like to see me cover. I'm also working on a couple of other videos that are going to show you the most economical way of working out the backing fabric for your quilt, as well as a few other different subjects. Hope to see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.